They call us Vargus Julian sparring, Henry says in a soft voice. He leans in a little closer over the corner table that they are in before he continues in a whisper. We don't just let anyone in. There's a big old proving ground for newcomers, but we need fresh meat for this war. Sandra Sharp Bellevue shifts in her spot beside sparring and clears her throat. What he's saying is that we'll let you join up, but we won't be able to make you a full-on member until you finish proving yourself. And this offer is open to the rest of your team too, sparring says to the rest of the Turncoat Coalition soldiers that are gathered around them in the dingy old dive, simply called Red Fern Bar, that hadn't been open for business since the beats first made landfall on Allegra. It had been a few Earth Standard weeks since the beats arrived, and the meals that had been left on a few of the tables in the establishment were giving off quite the aroma. However, war wasn't the cleanest business, so no one seemed to pay the stench much heed. The ex-coalition soldiers had been through a lot over the past month or so, and they had gotten themselves into a bit of a working relationship with Allegra's militia. But Sparring knew that there was a lot more in store for this little team of soldiers than just that. The militia was fine and dandy. He had friends in the ranks of the militia, but their goals only seemed to reach the horizon. They lacked the vision to see what wasn't right in view. They just wanted their freedom from the coalition. And, in the case of a lot of militia fighters, they couldn't care less about the rest of the galaxy. The Vargus, while not necessarily being sworn to fight against the coalition, had spent a lot of years, a lot of resources, and a lot of blood in the fight against the tyrants. However, the coalition and its dictatorial leadership weren't the only tyrants out there. There were warlords, slavers, monarchies, cults, and so many other people who were oppressing their subjects, and the Vargus were always at the ready to be hired out in order to fight against those entities. Oh, for a price, of course. However, not everyone went out to hire Vargus fighters and operatives. In the eyes of some who didn't hire Vargus for contracts, they saw the way that Vargus did things as too slow, too messy, and a billion other excuses. No one seemed to truly value what the Vargus stood for and what they were capable of. That was their loss, though. Sparring wasn't about to beg or plead, neither was Vargus. They had more than enough work, and when there weren't contracts for him that were handed down, Sparring was more than happy to freelance or just do what he knew needed doing. Every real Vargus fighter was given enough leash that they could more or less do what they willed, because they were thoroughly vetted, and those with inordinate levels of bloodlust were rooted out, as were the cowards. Sparring had made a point of explaining how all the things worked with the Vargus that he could with the recruits to be. Of course, certain particulars had been left out for the sake of security in the event that the team before him didn't bite and didn't join up, but he had been around long enough and seen enough people to know that he already had them in. All he had to do now was get them to out and say what was clearly in their hearts already. So Sharp presses the group after a few beats. Sharp, they came this far. They're clearly interested, Sparring says as he stands from the table. He looks those gathered in the eyes before he goes on. I'm not here to rush any of you. I'm happy to watch from a distance even longer as you all continue fighting for your homeworld, but just know, the fight is much, much bigger than this. This is just one desert world with just a few million people who need fighting for. There's a whole galaxy out there with more people who need help. I can tell that you all aren't the types to just sit back and watch suffering go on, so just know there's a way to help. The man in charge of the motley crew of ex-soldiers, Chase York, straightens, offers a quick salute, and then asks, "Is it possible for us to finish what we started here before we ship off to the corners of the known galaxy?" Sparring offers the man a knowing smile. Vargus doesn't ship you off wherever they want. They let you choose assignments at your will. Of course, there are times we might press someone to take part in a job. But we don't force people. Someone forced into something they want no part in is more apt to die. The Art of War talks about how men fight better when they are fighting for their homes. We find that they fight better when they agree with a cause as well. Ergo, Vargus has no interest in forcing jobs on their people. So this all boils down to the whole survivability thing that you told us about last time we talked. Then E1 Normandy, Chase's second, surmises. Exactly, Sparring nods. It's all about living to fight another day. As such, we might have to work a little longer to get a job done, but we aren't losing people in the process. Then, well, what would you need from us? Chase asks on behalf of his team. Sparring looks the team of 15 over yet one more time. He had been watching this particular group for a long while now, several years in fact, but he had been doing so from the shadows. He had helped them out on occasion as well, but he preferred working from the shadows as much as possible. Like a true Vargus fighter, he was all too happy to stay out of the limelight and to remain as a gray man that no one would take notice of. Going under the radar meant that he was safer, which, as was usually the goal, meant that he could stay alive more easily. Staying alive was the goal. It was the mantra. It was the mission. Sparring had also pulled some strings in the coalition's ranks on Allegra to see to it that this particular group was properly tested. He didn't want to recruit just anyone. He wanted soldiers who had seen some action and knew the ways of the galaxy. He wanted them to be able to adapt, and he wanted to see them do it while under pressure. Chase's team did just that. They put down several threats that Sparring handpicked, and, thanks to their rather explosive performances and choices, the team earned the moniker Bombshells. While not all of them were the prettiest sacks of meat to grace the surface of a planet, they had a knack for blowing things up with, or without the aid of traditional demolitions. They were as dangerous as any bomb that might get dropped on an enemy. And that made them the perfect choice for Sparring. In his eyes, this team would be able to do many times more for the galaxy than he and Sharp ever did, and they'd be able to pick up where he and Sharp left off too, when he and she finally decided to retire. As a bit of a give-me final test to see if the team was actually up to the task of joining Vargus and truly willing to risk their lives for it, Sparring had told them to meet him and Sharp a long, long ways behind beat lines. It was incredibly dangerous to stray this far from the friendly trenches that humanity was fighting for the planet from, but Sparring knew that the team would be up to it, even though they had to travel across half the planet to get here to do it. As Sparring saw things, this was just another test that he could report back to Vargus leadership that the team went through in order to earn them a place within the group. "How's about you and your team go out and kill me a beat queen?" Sparring asks after a short few beats. "Doing something like that is sure to win the approval of my higher-ups. They'll know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that you're one of us. And I assume not dying is a part of this whole mission too?" Chase asks with a morbid chuckle. Sparring smirks, and then nods. Survivability is one of the key traits of any Vargus fighter. "And suppose we do this job for you. Do we get any pay?" Chase asks, a brow raising at the proposal. Sparring chuckles and shakes his head. "You've got to prove yourself to the higher-ups before they start offering you jobs or allow you to take on jobs under the name of Vargus. This here is your proving ground, one of your final ones, if I have my way. Will you be watching us on the whole mission?" Watching, recording, and reporting back. Sparring nods. "What if we need your help?" "I'm inclined to keep every Vargus fighter alive, even those who've yet to officially be admitted. I may have to neglect to mention my involvement to leadership if I do have to step in for all of your sakes, but odds are they expect as much." "And why's that?" "Because the Beats aren't some new foe. Vargus has fought them before under contract." "Then how come we're just now hearing about them?" "The Coalition would have warned us about some unstoppable horde of alien bugs coming our way if they knew about it. The few days we had to prepare for this wasn't what anyone would expect if anyone knew about these things. They're new to this galaxy, not to the universe. I've been getting a steady feed of intel on these things since word first broke about their arrival from Vargus." "There are Vargus people in other galaxies?" Chase asks, visibly shocked by the revelation. Sparring nods thoughtfully for a few moments before he answers, "Yes, Vargus people and normal people alike. Humanity has done much in the years since the Alexandrian Republic split from the Coalition, and the Coalition hasn't taken part in that growth by choice. As such, they aren't too keen on sharing information about the developments. Provided you do your job with Vargus well enough, you'll be able to see the universe in the future. But for now, we just think about, we just fight for, we just hope for Allegra and her freedom." "This looks like the place," Chase announces as he looks out over the rocky rolling hills on the outskirts of the Red Fern area. Areas this remote in the deserts of Allegra seldom had names. Instead, they were just referred to by their nearest population center, no matter how small that center might be. The town of Red Fern and its 100-ish residents wasn't much to look at in the grand scheme of things. That was precisely why Sparring had picked it out, because of how easy it was to overlook. There was no chance that anyone would interfere in the mission to come because it was such a remote location. Looking past Chase, Sparring eyes the yawning mouth of the beehive. He had been keeping tabs on the hole in the ground for several days and nights now, and knew that their best bet would be if they struck during daylight hours, when the majority of the beats were out and about looking for humans to kill. The hive should be mostly empty, and if Chase and his team did things fast enough, it would be even emptier in short order. Of course, Sparring knew that things could get really bad really quick if the patrolling beats caught a whiff of the pheromones of the rest of the hive when the attack started, but today didn't seem to be particularly windy. Any pheromones that dead, dying, or scared beats sent off wouldn't get too far with the winds being as dead as they were right now. Based on the weather, things should hold out like this for a while longer as well. Things were working out perfectly for Chase and his team so far, and Sparring was pleased with that. He knew that the team didn't need any more testing to join the Vargus. They had proven themselves to him, so an easy mission wasn't something he was too worried about. Of course, there was still plenty more testing and such to go from here for the team before they were officially members of Vargus and able to take on jobs of their own, but that was a fight for another day. For now, all that mattered was today and staying alive. Now, if only we could get some peace in this galaxy so we could bring back our old training missions, though, Sparring thinks whimsically as he recalls some of the tales of old before the Alexandrians rose up for freedom, and before the Coalition really clamped down on everyone's throats. A lot of the tales of what Vargus used to be were from before his time, but he had been alive to see some of the changes toward the negative in the universe he lived in now. But he knew enough to know what history taught about times like those he lived in right now. It was only a matter of time before everyone started rising up under the banner of freedom. Tyranny had an expiration date. Sparring lets out a short chuckle as he is reminded of what his old trainer told him years back. Just you wait until the revolutions happen, guns for hire like us can get rich while we're doing the same jobs we've always done. It's a recipe for success. Sparring had waited and waited for the broader push for freedom to arise for years, but nothing meaningful came up. There were occasional rebellions and uprisings, but nothing that stuck, really. All the while the Coalition just kept becoming more and more overbearing. At this point in his life, Sparring just hoped that he'd live to see the beginning of the push for freedom now. "We made pretty good time getting here," Sharp says under her breath so only Sparring can hear her. "We might be back home by nightfall at this rate." Sparring nods but says nothing. He was interested in seeing just how Chase and the rest of the bombshells did on this little mission. "What's our plan of attack?" Boss Normandy asks after a couple of minutes. Chase lets out a sigh before he answers. "If I'm being 100% honest, I would have loved to just blow the whole hive up. What isn't killed in the blast would be buried alive. But Sparring here says he wants the Queen's head. Doesn't mean we can't use some explosives, though one of the team members pipes up. "No, it doesn't," Chase agrees, "but we will need to be careful. I'm not too interested in burying myself or any of you alive because we got too excited." Normandy nods along for a moment before he says, "I'll prep some of our fun guns. After that, I'll make sure all of our normal ones are prepped too." "Sounds like a plan," Chase nods. Sparring watches as Normandy and a few other soldiers make their way to one of the ATVs that the team had taken, and they begin offloading a few cases of ammo and a few weapons as well. The team was efficient in their work. That much was sure, but Sparring wasn't too keen on how exposed they all were right now. Sure, they were tucked away in a gully between a few of the steeper hills, but Chase didn't have anyone or anything keeping an eye out for hostiles coming from above right now. Such a misstep could get people killed. Sparring makes a mental note to correct Chase once the mission was over, and he pushes the thought down before deciding if he should include it in the report. The beats weren't the kind of enemy that planned ambushes and took advantage of terrain. They were more or less mindless hordes of chitin. Numbers was their strategy. Numbers and brutality. However, Sparring knew all too well that it still wasn't wise to not cover yourself. Even a stupid enemy could get lucky. "Jen, Eric, I need you to make sure our flamethrowers are in working order," Chase orders, as he takes a few steps toward the beat hive in the distance. "I'm going to keep an eye on the enemy over here and keep working on my plan." Want me to get a drone out there so we can get a better look at the hive? Another soldier asks. No, I want you to use it to make sure nothing sneaks up on us. Chase shakes his head. I'll manage without. Sparring nods approvingly at the latest order. Well, he finally is taking care of watching his six. Better late than never. Sparring had been in enough combat situations to know that protocols weren't always followed perfectly, so he could see why Chase might put off getting an aerial view of things, even though he had the means to get it early on. At the same time, however, Sparring can't help but feel like leaving one's flanks exposed was far too risky. It wasn't anything that a true Vargus team would do. But that's where he came in. He was supposed to be the team's guide, and he was supposed to show them what it meant to be Vargus. While this particular mission was a hands-off affair, it was his first up-close experience watching the team work. He'd finally be able to give good pointers on what they needed to improve on and what they were doing well. Without a shadow of a doubt, Sparring knew that the bombshells were well on their way to becoming Vargus, just based on how well-oiled of a machine they were right now. Everyone was doing something, even without orders. Sure enough, a few soldiers were even posted atop the hills above him now, where they are also keeping an eye out for hostiles. They've come a long way over the years. Sharp notes from beside Sparring. Sparring nods once more. So have you decided on if we're going to retire after we get them started? Sharp pries. Sparring looks over at Sharp at long last and sees the woman is leaning against an ATV while holding her favorite sniper rifle. She looked graceful, if such a thing were possible. For a moment, Sparring feels a pang of hurt as he thinks about what could have been if he had ever worked up the courage to marry the woman before him. After losing his own wife 16 years ago, he had been broken. He thought he was beyond repair. Sharp had brought him back from the brink. The woman was something else. She had a way of bringing everyone back into their proper orbits before they burned themselves out. Resisting the urge to smirk, Sparring reminds himself that Sharp was also one of the most menacing assassins in the ranks of Vargus, and that the coalition had an immense bounty on her head. Problem was, they didn't know her face or much of anything about her. They just knew that there was one lone sniper responsible for a whole host of jobs. Sharp was everything in one. Sparring knew that his life could have gone quite a bit differently if he had married Sharp instead of his wife all those years ago. He wouldn't have done anything differently, though, if he were to go back. Those years he had with Jenna were worth every single second of pain that he felt since he lost her. We're all set, Boss Jen calls out from the ATVs. We heading in on foot or on our vehicles? On foot, Chase answers, and we're taking a direct path too. There aren't any sentries about. Sparring nods silently, making further mental notes for his later report. Chase had learned a lot since he had first found the boy years ago, and it was satisfying seeing how good of a soldier that he had become. Between using his own skills right now and also leveraging the information that Sparring had provided, Chase seemed to be perfectly prepared to take out the Beat Queen without difficulty. Sighing, Sparring can't help but think, now, if only the rest of the people on Allegra were this composed, we could have stopped the Beats in their tracks right from the beginning. Instead, we're out here in the heat, hoping we can put an end to their exponential growth. Team, form up, Chase calls out, rallying his soldiers for their advance. It doesn't take a minute before they're all gathered around, and then Chase orders, follow me, we're going in. Fan out and keep your eyes peeled for hostiles. We'll pull back if we get spotted too soon because I don't feel like getting caught in the middle of a big angry hive. There is a chorus of affirmations and the bombshells head out. Sparring writes down a few notes on a small notepad and then starts after the team, Sharp in tow. Before long, Chase and the others are all out of the firmer rocky soils of the hills and are following a sandier wash at the foot of one of the hills between them and their quarry. The team is moving a little slower now thanks to the softer terrain, which seems to want to eat each person as they sink a little deeper into the sand now that they are heavy laden in weapons, munitions, and supplies for the little raid. Sparring sighs nostalgically at the sight as he is reminded of some of his past jobs and such when he followed crews into the desert. He hoped this time would be quite unlike some of those others where the sand did end up swallowing up some soldiers once they had fallen in battle. This fight was supposed to be different, and he'd do everything in his power to keep everyone breathing. This wasn't just a Vargus thing where he was trying to keep himself and everyone else alive. He cared about Chase's team. He had watched them long enough and done enough to get them where they all were that he felt like they were family to him. He wasn't about to let any of them die on this mission. Feels weird every time we do this, Sharp says after a few minutes. Sparring sounds. Every time we just watch a new team do their thing and just report back on it, all Sharp clarifies, just feels weird. I don't like sitting idle when people are fighting for their lives. Sparring nods. He had already known that Sharp felt the same way as he did with the mission, so her words simply echoed that truth for him. A few moments pass before Sharp asks in a caring tone, "You thinking about our job on Hotep?" "I am." "Me too. But this one will be different, we both know that." "I do. We aren't about to lose anyone this time around." Again, Sparring nods. After all of these years, he and Sharp were on the same wavelength for a lot of the stuff they thought about. Sparring had learned over the years that this wasn't too uncommon with people who spent as much time together as he and Sharp did. Same for those who went through the same godless hellholes too. There was a reason why soldiers called each other brothers after brutal deployments, and there was a reason why so many of them remained in touch after they got home too. The world they had left to fight for becomes just as foreign to them as the planet they warred on when they got back. The only piece of familiarity, safety and family that they had once it was all over was their brothers and sisters in arms. An uneventful half-hour passes before Sparring finally stops behind Chase and the rest of the bombshells who are peering into the void of the beat hive just a dozen or so meters away from where they had been halted. "Jet, can you send your drone up and have it keep an eye out for us while we're in there?" Chase asks. "Yes, sir," Jet says before shedding his pack and busying himself with the machine. Looking at the rest of the team, Chase says, "Now, team, we're diving into this thing headfirst, and there might just be hostiles everywhere, even in the walls. Keep your eyes peeled, keep things quiet, and don't be afraid to stab first and ask questions later." The last line elicits some chuckles from those gathered, but no one seems to fall out of character too much. They all had their heads in the game and were clearly comfortable with the threats before them. In short, this wasn't their first rodeo, and they all knew it. Unlike some of the other soldiers that Sparring had worked alongside, however, the bombshells weren't cocky in their confidence, which he found refreshing and reassuring. This truly was the best team that he had ever hoped to rope into Vargus. What surprised Sparring the most about the whole team being such a good match for Vargus was the fact that it truly was the entire team that was good enough to join up. Normally people would only be invited individually here and there. Getting so many people in all at once was unheard of. That was one of the reasons why he had been forced to spend so much time watching, guiding, and rooting for the bombshells. Vargus leadership struggled with the idea of so many good people all being together in a fighting unit from day one. "All right, that's secure. Let's get in and get the job done sooner rather than later," Chase says as he gives a strong tug on the rope attached to an anchor that he had driven into some packed dirt not far from the hole they'd all be going down soon enough. Beside him, several other anchors had also been put down, and the rest of Chase's team are checking them as well. Sparring watches as the bombshells all begin descending into the mouth dug into the earth by the aliens. They make quick work of the effort, even though they had to drop down equipment and weapons alongside themselves, but they were a well-oiled machine in many respects. Smiling inwardly, Sparring can't help but congratulate himself for finding such a capable team, and not a bunch of mindless cogs like a lot of coalition teams oftentimes were. "We'd best get moving," Sparring eventually says once it's just him and Sharp on the surface. Sharp nods and makes her way over to one of the anchored ropes. Stooping down, she fixes a simple carabiner attached to a line that she hooks onto her own belt. Putting another carabiner onto a different rope, she holds it up for Sparring, who readily takes it. The two of them tie themselves on and use a few additional rappelling pieces that the bombshell team had left out for them, and then they make their way over to the maw that had consumed the team moments before. As he walks, Sparring attempts to challenge himself to get an idea of just how any beats called this hive home based on the multitude of tracks all around him. The multi-legged abominations left quite the distinct tracks on Allegra's soils, but after a few moments, Sparring realizes that he didn't have a hope in estimating just how many beats passed through the area. There are grooves dug into the soil where hundreds, possibly thousands, of beats have passed through going in all directions. There are odd tracks going in other directions as well, which Sparring can get a rough estimate off of, but he knew that those tracks were only taken by the vast, vast minority of the aliens. They were going to be impossibly outnumbered if the patrolling and scavenging beats came back to the hive earlier than expected, which scared Sparring more than he'd ever let on. He hated the idea of being killed by giant bugs. The thought of it happening underground in their warrens just made the thought even more frightening. Sparring pulls himself from his worries as he gets within a few paces of the hive's entrance. Peering inside the hole, Sparring sees that the drop is an astounding 20 meters or so. Down on the ground, Sparring watches as the bombshells fan out and ensure that their surroundings are secure. He can see that the ground all the way down there is dark and earthy, a sure sign that the cavern was made by the beats, and its walls were secured with mud that the creatures made themselves, much like the insects that humanity was familiar with, just a lot larger. Not needing to check with Sharp, Sparring immediately starts rappelling, satisfied that the team below him has done their job perfectly once again. Sharp is quick to follow, and the duo make their way down quickly. And that looks like the main tunnel over there. Chase is in the middle of briefing his team by the time he is within earshot for Sparring. We don't want to go out that way, not yet. At least the larvae and such are going to be down there, and there's bound to be some adult beats. Queen should be down the main tunnel. I think. We can decide what we want to do with all the rest of them after we kill the queen. Sparring's feet finally touch the ground, and he frees himself from the rappelling rig. Looking around quickly, he confirms Chase's suppositions of what they were looking at down here immediately. Beat coming our way from the poopy area, Normandy says as he grabs his rifle. He hesitates long enough to confirm that his weapon is silenced, and then raises the weapon to bear. Don't shoot, Chase hisses, suppressor or no suppressor, we're keeping things quiet. At least until we get to the queen. Normandy sighs, lowers his weapon, and then asks, well, any volunteers to help me kill this thing the old-fashioned way then? Chase frowns, makes a half shrug, and then grabs his own rifle. Affixing his bayonet, he motions for the others to do the same, and then he approaches the tunnel that Normandy had been worrying about. Sparring watches as Normandy follows Chase, and he eyes the rest of the bombshells team as well as they prepare themselves to delve deeper into the hive. They all begin donning various visors that are bustling with lenses and sensors in order to see in the dark, which was an incredibly valuable tip that Sparring had been given at the very beginning when news broke about the beats from his higher-ups. Evidently, the beats reacted to the lights visible to humans, so all of the night vision, thermals, and such were things that could be safely utilized to hunt the creatures down without stirring them from their slumber. Remember to check the walls for any beats that might be burrowed in there, Sparring warns, speaking to the bombshells for the first time in a while. He knew that they had heard him the first 100 times that he had warned about the beats burrowing, but he just wanted to be certain that no one died to such a thing. There is a chorus of responses that the warning was heard in very short order. You take left, Chase says under his breath to Normandy. We should hide as well, Sparring advises the others. Everyone scatters, getting out of view of the tunnel that Sparring and Sharp are preparing to ambush the beat at so that the creature doesn't have any sort of warning. Chase suddenly lunges away from his hiding spot, followed by Normandy. Chase, spurred on by his own experience and from teachings from Sparring, stabs into the soft spot where the beat's head meets its lengthy neck. Meanwhile, Normandy drives his bayonet straight into the dripping maw of the creature, smothering whatever sound it could have possibly made in the process. The creature stiffens for a second before immediately crumbling atop itself, lifeless. If it wasn't for the tips we were given on how to kill these things, I'm sure we'd be in just as much danger as every other person that the coalition is throwing out onto the front, Sparring thinks somberly as his heart goes out to all of the poor mudders, commandos, expeditionary soldiers, and everyone else who is forced to square off against the beats face to face. Without the know-how on how to properly kill a beat, their death toll seemed to make complete and total sense. Sparring knew that he should, for the sake of being a good human, go out and teach those serving under the coalition's colors how to kill a beat safely, quickly, and effectively, but he had a reasonable suspicion that doing so would spell his own demise. It wouldn't take long before the coalition pried and found out how he got the information that he got. Sharing valuable tips like that wouldn't let him continue his life as a simple gray man to the coalition that they could easily overlook. He'd be dead within a week if his past experiences had any bearing. One down, a whole host of them to go chase, says as he flicks his rifle to the side, sending a lot of the beat's light blue blood flying in the process. Normandy plants his foot firmly on the dead beat's head and then tugs his weapon from its grossly alien mouth. Spitting to the side, he then says, "The sooner these things are all dead, the better." If only they knew just how hard it was to get rid of all of the beats, Sparring thinks, somberly. According to all of the data and reports that he had seen to date, there weren't any instances of a planet that was invaded by beats remaining free of the creatures indefinitely. He knew that there was a first for everything, and he hoped prayed that Allegra might be the first planet to be free of the beasts, but he knew the odds were slim. However, that wouldn't stop him from fighting. It wouldn't stop him from sharing what information he could share safely. It wouldn't stop him from helping expand Vargus in order to bring the best people and weapons into the fray. Allegra was, and always would be, his home. He'd die on that hill, if pressed, not that he had any intention of dying, since such a thought was just as alien to him as the beats were, thanks to Vargus training. "Let's get a move on," Chase says to his team. Bending down, he grabs the dead beat, motions for Normandy to join him, and they both drag the creature away from the tunnel's entrance to make it a little harder for the body to be found. Sparring follows the team deeper into the beat hive, now that the dead beat's body is stashed away, and he keeps his head on a swivel, anticipating any and every threat that could arise. However, nothing comes. Frowning, Sparring mentally pores through the notes that he had been given about the beats. After a few moments, he realizes that there wasn't a whole lot of data on people actually going into large hives like this one. And by not a lot, that meant nothing. Not a single data entry. Sure, there were some reports of people exploring with manned or unmanned expeditions some of the smaller hives out there, which there were many of on every planet that got invaded, but major hives like this one were untouched. In short, this mission was virgin ground. Swallowing, Sparring finally speaks up. "We have to be sure to take all the notes we can on this." Why, Chase impulsively asks. He is about to say something else when realization dawns on his face. "We're the first people to go into a hive, aren't we?" Sparring shakes his head. "No, just the first to go into a hive this big, according to the data I saw." A beat passes before Sparring goes on, sharing all the data that he had yet to share on the beats. There were tidbits on how many queens each hive had, where the largest queens were, what queens were the most dangerous, but all of that data came from much smaller hives. Those smaller hives, oddly enough, were heavily guarded. You think that this hive might be so unprotected because it's so far from the front lines, Chase eventually asks some time into the monologue from Sparring. That could be possible, Sparring nods. He isn't at all sure what to think right about now thanks to the unexpected findings, and he can't help but hate it. He was walking into the complete unknown, and that was dangerous. His Vargus training had taught him to avoid situations like this whenever and wherever it was possible. Yet Sparring can't help but feel like he can't turn back now. This wasn't some normal mission, this was something that could turn the tide for his homeworld. Potentially, if they found out some great weakness for the beats, this mission could save additional planets as well. It could even work to save galaxies that could very well have fallen to the beats. This was something much larger than everyone down here. It was larger than everyone on the surface of Allegra too. Sparring's eyes drop to the team that he had taken down here, and he momentarily wonders if this was their final act in this life. A second passes as he wonders that, and to his surprise, he doesn't get the sinking feeling that he had learned to listen to, which warned him if a mission was about to go bad. If anything, this seemed like a mission that would go off without a hitch, but he isn't about to tell anyone else that. He had learned from experience that sharing such a feeling made people sloppy and effectively sealed the fate of soldiers who then took risks that they wouldn't have otherwise taken. "I got something," Normandy whispers as he holds up a hand for everyone to stop. "What is it?" Chase asks as Normandy approaches the wall of the tunnel that they are in. Got one sleeping beat in here, Normandy answers in a whisper. He drives his bayonet into the wall, and there is a short, quiet squeal as the beat within the muddy wall dies and then slowly starts folding out from the wall. Chase takes a sharp breath and starts, where there's one. "Oh, there are plenty more," Sir Normandy interrupts. Motioning deeper into the tunnel, he says, "I'm seeing easily another 50 of them further on. We should work quick." "How'd you spot them?" Jet asks as he fiddles with his visor. "I've been trying all the settings we've got to see into those walls." Slowly, and with a bit of a smug grin, pulling his rifle-mounted blade from the deadbeat, Normandy answers, "I was fiddling with my radar set, turned sensitivity up so much that it detects the tiniest movements that the beats make when they're in there. Aside from that, I figured that normal bugs have heat signatures, so beats would too. The heat signature turns me onto them. The radar confirms bing, bang, boom, dead bug." "Sounds like we've got at least one important breakthrough," Sparring mutters to himself as he whips out his notepad and quickly scribbles down the findings for the benefit of all of humanity. Other groups had made note of the heat signatures in the past, but those were prone to give plenty of false positives. The radar confirmation was an innovation that Sparring was certain could turn the tide of many wars for worlds against the beats. Shaking his head and feeling like something like this should have been figured out decades ago, Sparring simply mutters, "Wait until I tell the rest of Vargus about this." By the time Sparring had finished with his notes, he sees that most of the beats in the tunnel are dead now. The team was making quick work of them all, which made him quite proud. He found it strange that there might be beats resting during daylight hours, but perhaps Allegra's extended days necessitated such rest periods for the creatures. Of course, Sparring knew that this meant that there were likely more beats down here resting up to wreak havoc later on as well, so he is sure to keep an eye out for them. "Leave the beats where they are. We don't have time to stash all the bodies," Chase says right before he drives his bayonet into the wall of mud that he's standing in front of. He waits for the beat within to stop squealing before he goes on. "Once these are dead, we need to hustle and get on down to the Queen. If the first one we killed isn't enough to get their attention, they're sure to know there's danger with all of these dead beats. Remember the pheromones Sparring here told us they put out when they die?" Sparring nods to himself, appreciating the fact that Chase had taken everything that he had shared to heart. There had been many times in the past that others hadn't. It got people dead every time. Seeing that Chase was smart enough to listen did nothing but set Sparring's feelings about the team in concrete. They were clearly Vargus material. In many ways, Sparring can't help but feel like any further testing and training would almost be insulting based on how unnecessary it was. However, training was what kept people alive, and no team could know everything, so he wasn't about to skimp out on his responsibilities to them. The training, testing, all of it, would continue on as planned, insulting or not. Picking up the pace to a slow jog, Sparring does his best to keep up with the team as they seem to try to make up for lost time. He isn't too sure what the rush is, besides just the risk of the pheromones being sensed, but he isn't ready to fault anyone or put the mission to a halt. As near as he can tell, everything is still going off as safely as possible. "First side tunnel, looks too small to be our little Queenie," Chase says as he passes an opening. "Second tunnel, same story," Normandy sounds as he passes another opening on the other side of the main passageway that they are in. "Opening further up, sir. Looks like the one we're after," Jet calls out from the rear. Sparring nods to himself, pleased that Jet had picked out the most likely tunnel. Of course, there was a chance that this wasn't the right one, seeing as how massive hives like this were technically still uncharted territory for humanity, but it was still the most likely one based on the information that they all had available. The team charges into the tunnel offshoot and begin raising their weapons, ready to engage whatever adversary may arise. Knowing how serious of a situation everyone might be getting into, Sparring brings his rifle to bear as well, and he sees Sharp doing the same. There was no knowing just how many beats there might be inside of the Queen's room, so a shoot-first approach was probably the best bet for everyone here. "Chamber opens up ahead," Chase says loud enough for the team to hear. Looks like it's empty." Sparring's brow raises and he stumbles slightly as he breaks stride and slows down. If everything leading up to this moment wasn't enough of a warning that there was something very wrong with this whole mission, then this was it. Thanks to his slowing down, Sparring is now several paces from the team, and he watches from a bit of a distance as they burst into the chamber ahead and begin opening fire. He is perplexed for a moment, but quickly reminds himself that there were still at least some beats down here and that those were likely what the team was engaging. It was likely just some final few sentries, or something, that were guarding the obviously abandoned hive. Stepping into the room a few moments after the team, Sparring sees that his hypothesis was false. Laying on the far end of the room lie not one, but 5 different beat queens, all dead. Around the queens are a small assortment of beats that must have been attendants, or something to that tune. A few beats look a little larger and better built and must have been guards, but there wasn't a whole lot of them. The hive wasn't some abandoned shell of what it once had been. There were still queens. Judging by their size, the queens were likely quite important to the beat war effort as well. Why were they so easy to get to? Chase asks the question that's on everyone's minds. Jet, do you have any radio signal to the outside world? Sparring asks the team's techie. Jet shakes his head, not really. There's a weak signal every now and then, but it's nothing we can make use of. The beats are blocking our signal all the way out here. What are you thinking? Old Man Chase asks in a worried voice. I'm thinking that we might be missing something. Big Sparring frowns. Looking at his watch, he checks the time and date. It's August 4th, midday, and I'd bet everything I've got that there's history that's about to be made today. However, it isn't all the way back here. You think they're all on the front? Sharp asks, a tremble in her voice, all of the beats from this hive. Surveying the carnage around him, Sparring sighs. I think there's a good chance that all of the beats from the whole planet are up there, close to that at least. There must be some huge assault that they've got planned. How are we just now finding out about it then? Chase demands as he paces to and fro, his hands wringing. We could have been up there making a difference. But instead, we're all the way back here. We can't possibly get back to the front in time if the beats are doing some huge charge today. There might not even be a front left by the time we got back. How are we supposed to? Enough. Sparring barks as he holds up his hand. Remember, what we've learned about beats and their hives on our little mission here will be worth it as soon as we can spread the word. No one has been in a hive this large before. We'll be able to do things that no human has ever done, see things, all of that. It's too late for us to join the main fight on the front lines, but we can spend every last second that we have down here getting the intel that we can to save humanity. This mission is changing. I'd say this might be a true Vargus mission for you and your team, Chase. So let's get things sorted out. Let's mark down every detail about the hive, and let's stay alive long enough that we can report back to the outside world and to Vargus. Chase trembles slightly, and he points toward the exit, but this is the way things are going to go. Sparring interrupts once more. I'm sorry, but this is all outside of our control now. We're all getting forced into this, maybe even by God. I don't know. We've been given an opportunity we can't squander. Do as I say, stay alive, and we'll be seen as heroes in due time. A second passes before Chase nods and motions for his team to comply. Sparring lets out a shrill breath. He didn't like the idea of forcing the team into something like this, but he can see the determination in their eyes and see that they knew the truth in his words. They had to do this job, and they had to do it now. There likely wouldn't be any opportunities like this for anyone else anytime soon. This was their chance to change the tide in the universe-wide war against the beats. They'd all find out soon enough if they could make history on this day, like everyone who was fighting for their lives on the front. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you loved it. Please remember to subscribe if you did like it so you can see more videos like this. And please give us a like and a comment too. I'll see you in the next one.